Have you ever found yourself watching a political showdown? You see all the fiery speeches, the bold promises, only to then see the whole thing just collapse into a really predictable surrender? It's one of those things that's both baffling and, let's be honest, deeply frustrating. Well, today we're going to dive into the work of scholar Tad Stormer to really unpack the structural physics behind this whole political phenomenon and maybe get a handle on why real change so often feels like it's just out of reach.
This quote, it really gets right to the heart of it. That feeling of just complete bewilderment when you see opposition leaders seem to, well, simply give in. The point here is that it's not some personal failing or, a lack of courage. What the source material argues is that it's a systemic issue, a really deep-seated structural problem playing out right in front of us.
Just think back to the last major government shutdown debate. You saw the whole performance, right? The stern condemnations, a few, well, pretty cringeworthy social media posts, and that insistence that this time, oh yes, this time the line was going to be held. And then, right at the critical moment, that all too familiar capitulation. It's a pattern that's become so common, it's almost a political pathology, really. A culture of surrender.
So what's the diagnosis for this kind of behavior? Well, the source proposes something it calls Sturmer's first law. And put simply, it's this. People in positions of authority want first and foremost to stay in those positions of authority. Keeping the job, the status, getting invited to the right parties, all of that becomes way more important than actually doing their job. So in the end, self-preservation always seems to trump the duty to serve the people they're supposed to represent.
Okay, so if self-preservation is the motive, then what are the mechanics? What are the things that enforce this culture of surrender? In this next bit, we're going to explore the ideologies that hold the whole thing so firmly in place.
Right, what's so fascinating here is how the source breaks down these two dominant ideologies that, despite all their surface differences, they actually serve the exact same function. So on one side, you've got conservative nationalism. It's very explicit with its flags and its reverence for the military and police, and very clear hierarchies of who counts and who doesn't. But then you have liberal nationalism, which the source describes as being far, far sneakier.
See, liberal nationalism, it sounds progressive. It uses all the right language, justice and progress. But in practice, what it does is it neutralizes any real opposition from within. It insists that procedural norms are somehow more sacred than just outcomes. It'll condemn an injustice, sure, but then in the next breath, it demands you respect the very institution that's enforcing it. And this just brilliantly illustrates the core contradiction. It performs opposition while creating these invisible boundaries that make any real structural change completely impossible.
So how do these ideologies actually work? They use what the source calls interruption points. First up is centralization. This is where you make the founding documents and the founders themselves sacred, so that any real challenge to them is treated like heresy. And second, there's criminalization. When opposition is finally forced to move outside the sanctioned channels, their actions get framed not as a challenge to injustice, but as a betrayal of the nation itself. And the result? Well, any challenge that steps outside the pre-approved lines is delegitimized before it can even get started.
But here's the twist. This whole culture of surrender, this insistence on obedience to a broken system, is, according to our source, profoundly at odds with a really deep and powerful tradition in American history. So let's explore that remarkable counter-narrative.
I mean, think about it. The demand that you just accept being a noble loser, that you obey a system even when you know it's unjust, well, that requires you to forget the Americans who looked at that very same demand and said, absolutely not.
Let's just take a moment to absorb this legacy of refusal. This isn't some fringe element of history. It's a central current. You've got Giles Corey in the Salem witch trials, Samuel Adams building the networks to challenge the British, Ona Judge escaping from Washington himself, Henry David Thoreau defining the very ideology of refusal, and Harriet Tubman building an entire system designed to nullify federal law. I mean, this is a powerful, powerful tradition of people who chose righteous defiance over complicit surrender.
The story of Giles Corey is, well, it's staggering. He was accused of witchcraft back in 1692, and he understood that entering any plea, guilty or not, would legitimize the court's corrupt authority. So he refused to speak a single word. They tortured him, pressing him under heavy stones, and his only response was to demand more weight. He chose to die rather than be complicit, denying the system the one thing it craved, his participation.
Then you see this principle evolve with someone like Samuel Adams. The man was a master strategist. He understood you don't just oppose power, you make it impossible for power to even function. He built these committees of correspondence, which was basically an infrastructure for resistance. And through these organized networks, he made British authority untenable, not by asking nicely, but by making the cost of enforcement simply too high for them to bear.
And then there's Anna Judge. She escaped enslavement from George Washington, arguably the most powerful man in the New Republic, and his attempts to recapture her were relentless. Her resistance wasn't some single heroic speech. It was 5 decades of waking up every single day and choosing not to break, choosing not to go back. It was a whole life of endurance against the full crushing force of the state.
Henry David Thoreau, well, he provides the philosophical backbone for this whole tradition. When he saw that his tax money was being used to fund a war to expand slavery, he simply refused to participate. And his argument is just crystal clear. If the system demands your complicity in its own injustice, then your moral obligation is to refuse. Your first duty is not to the law, but to what is right.
And the ultimate proof of this principle in action has to be the Underground Railroad. I mean, the Fugitive Slave Act was the law of the land, signed by the president, enforced by federal marshals, the whole shebang. And yet, Harriet Tubman and thousands of others made that law completely meaningless. They built a sophisticated, clandestine, and unbreakable network that proved that organized resistance could absolutely defeat a system, even when that system holds all the formal power.
So, you see, these aren't just inspiring stories. They actually contain a playbook. The source material distills all of these historical successes down into a set of core strategic principles for what real resistance actually requires. Okay, let's look at this framework. Successful resistance isn't just about protest. It's about building a parallel structure. It all starts with a fundamental denial of centralized authority, a refusal to grant legitimacy to a corrupt system. From there, it requires the creation of its own untraceable infrastructure, a steadfast refusal to play by the sanctioned rules that are designed to protect the status quo, and finally, as we saw with Anna Judge, it demands profound endurance. And right here, we find the defining factor, the key difference between this history of defiance and the modern culture of surrender. It really comes down to one thing: organization. It's the difference between organized networks with disciplined goals making power impossible to wield, versus individual leaders just, well, performing opposition for an audience.
And all of this brings our entire analysis squarely into the here and now. I mean, if these historical principles are the key, how on earth do they apply to the world we live in today?
The fundamental lesson from Samuel Adams's committees right through to the Underground Railroad is that success came from building decentralized, high-trust networks. They worked because they were physically or legally inaccessible to the state. They managed to create a space that was beyond the establishment's reach.
And so, that leaves us with this final, critical question. The historical playbook, it's clear, but the playing field has changed completely. In an age of pervasive digital tracking and total surveillance, where the state can potentially reach into every single corner of our lives, what does a decentralized, untraceable, and resilient network for change even look like now? That, right there, is the challenge to ponder.